I'm with David Brummer, who's a freelance journalist. Now, David, what sort of organizations do you work with as a freelance journalist?
So I've worked previously with things like I-24 News. I've been at the Jerusalem Post previously and also Times of Israel. And most recently with WorldNet Daily, which is run by evangelical Christians in America. They're kind of like the pro-Trump Second Amendment kind of people, and they're very happy that Trump won in November. And they take a look with a sort of Christian slant to the news, and that's basically what they do.
And what sort of area do you actually cover here in the Middle East?
So I was covering Israel and the Middle East. I was doing a Israel/Middle East morning brief, so looking at interesting stories from Israel, which at the moment tended to be dominated by the war, and then other things going on in the Middle East, things to do with Iran and Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, those sorts of things.
And of course, there's so many stories here in the Middle East, isn't there?
It's hard to kind of like whittle it down. There's so much going on. I was supposed to do about 15 stories, like briefs on them, and there could have been double that on some days. So yeah.
And how long have you lived here in the Holy Land?
I have been here since July 2007. So yeah, coming up for 18 years.
Was it fearful coming to Israel?
I don't think it was fearful. It's funny, I had only been here 5 times in my life before deciding to live here, and the longest time I'd ever spent here was a month when I was 16, sort of post GCSEs on a tour group. So I got some feel for the country, but I didn't really have a full understanding of what it was. But so I don't know if it was fearful. I think excitement was probably the main emotion.
And is this a good place actually to be based as a journalist?
I mean, yeah, just look at all the news organizations who, I know that Matty Friedman, who used to be at the AP, he said that when he was working there, and he stopped there, I think in 2014, that it had dozens of people covering this area of the world and had very few for the rest of the world. So this is really where the news, if you're here, this is where the news is at. So
Now, Israel is at war for over 500 days. Has that kept you very, very busy?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's always, at the moment there's a bit of a lull, although I'm not sure if there's going to be a resumption of sort of active hostilities as they were about a month or so ago. But yeah, there's always stuff going on. There's now there's a hostage deal, and before there were actions, there was Gaza and Lebanon. So yeah, it's definitely full on.
Have you been able to interview some of the hostage families?
Not personally, but I was on a WhatsApp group with the hostage families and getting press releases and so seeing the kinds of things that they were saying. And also they're not a monolith. There are different hostage families. But this was like one of the main groups dealing with, wanting the hostages to come out. They all want the hostages to come out. But some of them differ on the price that they're prepared to pay for the hostages coming out.
Must be heartbreaking just to hear their stories, isn't it?
It's terrible. And seeing the footage from recently of the emaciated men coming back and knowing that, those were sort of, quote unquote, the better ones is very difficult. Yeah, it's been extremely traumatic, obviously, for the last 16 months or so. And also knowing that corpses are being held there as well. Like, it's unconscionable.
As a freelance journalist, how do you find your stories?
Trying to mine contacts, speaking to people who are in the industry, using people that have previously worked in other areas. So that's kind of how I go about doing it.
So it's sort of friends of friends of friends sometimes, and you hear a story or you maybe see something in the news and think, oh, that would make a really great story.
That's right. And there's like games like 6 Degrees of Separation from Kevin Bacon, but if you're in Israel it's really 2 degrees. You always know someone who knows someone, and you can actually get to someone quite senior with very relatively few moves. So yeah.
Do you see a bias against Israel when it comes to reporting the news?
Absolutely. I mean, if you ask other people, they'd probably say, no, it's biased the other way. But I mean, I'm originally from the UK, and during the Second Lebanon War, I saw the reporting from BBC and Sky in particular, and I hadn't decided to move here at that point. But it was one of the reasons I did, was after that and seeing the way that it was being reported, I kind of thought, well, actually, this seems like such a terrible place. I want to go and live there. It's bizarre. I'm not quite sure what my thought process was there, it hasn't gotten any better in the last almost 20 years. I think it's pretty bad.
Why do you think there is such a bias?
That is a very good question.
Like, news is news, isn't it?
News is news, but news has become more about editorializing. These days, it's sort of like activist journalists. People often put air quotes around journalists because, they don't just give you the news, they kind of give their opinion of it. Especially also as there are other hotspots of the world where terrible things are going on, but you know what they say, no Jews, no news, and they seem to get ignored. So, look, there's been a very long history of anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that all of it is down to that, but there's definitely seems to be an animus that instructs a lot of the reporting.
And of course, BBC were even struggling to call the Hamas terrorists actual terrorists, weren't they?
And that's extraordinary. I mean, by any other metric, any other group, they would be labelled as terrorists. So someone like Jeremy Bowen, for example, who's their chief correspondent in this part of the world, I mean, I understand that he had a cameraman or somebody he was very close to in Lebanon who was killed by the IDF, maybe in the Second Lebanon War or some time ago. I'm not saying that his reporting was brilliant before that, but he's taken a very harsh line against Israel ever since that. I was in the UK for October 7th, so I was actually stuck there for 5 weeks until it was sort of like safe enough to come home. And I watched BBC News, and I could barely contain my irritation at what I was seeing on the TV.
Were you itching to get back when you actually saw what actually happened on October the 7th?
I mean, yes and no. I have a small child, and because of the situation, and we live in the center of the country, there were rockets every day, and so there was no kindergarten for him. So in a way, it was better for us to be out of it because there was no kindergarten there, but he was sort of safe with among me and my family. But yeah, there was, when you saw those images of people, they're backpacking in Thailand or whatever it was, and they're all rushing to get back to join the fight. There's something about this country that people really want to defend it, and yeah, so being away was difficult.
So you obviously did come back. What was it like living under war when you came back?
That was interesting. I mean, we had obviously had some sirens and needing to go into our safe room. For anyone who hasn't experienced it, being out in a car or something when a siren goes off is not particularly... in fact, the first Iranian ballistic missile attack, second one, I was actually driving and I got a message on my phone. There was like this long beep, and it was a triangle with an exclamation mark in it saying like find shelter as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, I was very close to home, so I could have gotten out the car and, I don't know, laid on the ground or something, whatever that would have done. But I decided, and I had my son in the car with my father-in-law as well, so I decided to actually park in my building and run inside to the shelter. So that was probably like a scary moment, because you have no idea exactly how much is coming in. But on a day-to-day life, it's not... I think people in the north over a certain period had it worse, because they were really, in certain parts of the north, they were really under attack constantly. And by the time we got home, it was less, but there was still some action, and obviously it was much closer to the actual time of the event. And I think that was... I was worried about being able to sort of fit back into the rhythm of life, like whether by not being here I would have missed something, but I think I got enough of an experience to kind of allay those fears.
We've talked about some of the bad journalists. Who were some of the best? Who were some of the best journalists?
And there's a whole bunch of good journalists. There's people like Lahav Harkov, who's at the Jewish Insider. There are Matti Friedman, when he writes, I don't know if he'd consider himself a journalist now, but he's a fantastic writer. Chaviv Retigur, who's at the Times of Israel, who appears now on his own podcast. He's very insightful. Seth Frantzman at the Jerusalem Post, who also is with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And Jonathan Spire, who's with the Middle East Forum, among other things. And he's actually reported from the situation in Syria. He was there after the fall of Assad, and he was actually in Syria before the fall of Assad as well. So he's kind of compares, but he's excellent and well worth following up on.
And of course, getting good journalism is very important, because it actually is a basis of how you think, isn't it? So what you see written is you're probably going to believe. So if it's bad journalism, you're going to believe it.
That's true. And these people they're scrupulous, they check their sources, whether they have biases, maybe, but it doesn't come out overly in what they're writing, and they give you the information as kind of as it's told to them, with some interpretation as well. And I think that's really important, and then you can make your own mind up, not kind of having some sort of party line that they stick to assiduously.
Do you think some bad journalism is just basically anti-Semitism?
I wonder what the motivation for it is. I mean, it depends what you determine as bad journalism. I mean, if it's sort of, let's take it for instance, maybe this is a good example, the Hamas, Gaza Health Ministry figures of casualties. Now, for the people living here who are in the know, you don't take that as gospel. You can't just assume, for example, the Al-Ali hospital incident, where within minutes, an hour, let's be generous, maybe it was an hour. They were saying that 500 people were killed by the IDF, and then it turned out that it was not only did the IDF not do it, it was hit a car park, not the hospital, and it was one of the Gazan terrorist groups who shot the rocket. But then that was parroted across the world, and you have people in influence who said, oh, it's a war crime and all the rest of it. And I'm not quite sure why the people reporting on it would report on it that way without, just accept as gospel. And in the same way that somebody, a spokesperson from the Israeli government or an Israeli government minister, I wouldn't necessarily just accept what they say as being the truth. You have to figure it out for yourself.
And of course, when organizations like the UN say, oh, there's been this many people killed, they're getting their figures from Hamas. So you can say, oh, well, it's the UN that's saying it. Well, it's not really the UN that's saying it. It's Hamas that's saying it, isn't it?
That's absolutely true. And the United Nations is really a baffling organization to some degree. Just look at the way, for example, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres talked about the hostages in Yemen, and he called on the Houthis to immediately release them. But yet when Israeli civilians are taken by Hamas and treated abysmally, as we can see, he doesn't say anything. So the United Nations, it's kind of, I think the sentiments behind the United Nations of trying to prevent war and trying to make a more peaceful world, very lofty ideals. But if you listen to someone like Hillel Neuer, the executive director of UN Watch, he will tell you that it's been hijacked by despots and tyrants.
Is it difficult to mentally prepare yourself sometimes? You will hear the stories of soldiers killed, Gaza's destroyed, hostages taken. Is it difficult when you're always hearing this bad news? Do you have to mentally prepare yourself?
Yes, it is difficult, and I think it's overwhelming at times. And I actually think you need to be a specific kind of personality to be able to sort of compartmentalize between what your job is and the human aspect. I'll give you, for instance, I went to the soccer field in Majd al-Shams in the Golan after those 12 Druze kids were killed by a Hezbollah rocket. And, there were families there who were grieving. There were people from the local municipality. The mayor spoke to us. And that was clearly an extremely difficult and emotional situation. And that's hard. We're humans. The people who are involved are obviously humans. And, you have to have a heart of stone not to be affected by things that you see and hear.
What is your hope for the future of Israel?
Other than the rebuilding of the Third Temple? There's a lot to hope for. Good, sound leadership. I make no comment as to whether we're having that at the moment. I think that a new generation of Palestinian leaders need to emerge who don't necessarily want the destruction of Israel. I think that has to be a reasonable starting point. The Middle East is a really blossoming place. We have the Abraham Accords, maybe an extension of those too. I think that was a really great idea that bore some very interesting fruit. So that's what I would hope, is more communication, more building, less destruction.
Are you feeling positive about the Donald Trump administration? And how did you feel that the Biden administration was, particularly towards Israel?
Well, I'll take Biden first. So the man himself was extremely supportive after October the 7th, and I think that was like a sort of a intrinsic reaction of him as a person. I think that was maybe him being authentic. I think he does have warm feeling toward Israel and comes from that kind of generation where he thinks differently about it. I think as his condition has clearly deteriorated and he was no longer so much in charge for the last definitely few months of his presidency. Figuratively, yes, but then obviously they did the coup d'etat and he still remained in power. But his administration was staffed by a lot of people who were a hangover from the Obama administration, and many of them implacably opposed to, is they wanted to reanimate the JCPOA, for example, the Iranian nuclear deal. There were people who were really anti the state of Israel and not particularly backward about showing that. So, and obviously we've seen the delivery of the munitions this week, which he held up and Harris held up despite Congress having given them the green light to send them. So there's that. I think it's always an issue with Donald Trump because Donald Trump does what Donald Trump wants to do and would like to do really what's best for him. And yeah, I think he has America's best interests at heart. But I think for the people who think that he's going to write some kind of blank check or he's going to be the fulfiller of right-wing maximalist dreams, I don't think that that's really living in a reality. I think he could be good. I think he's also one of the few people who can keep Netanyahu in check because clearly, and the Israeli establishment didn't pay attention to Biden and his people when they said, don't go into Rafah, don't go after Hezbollah. And we've seen that there's some success in that. So I think it's with Donald Trump, you really have to walk on eggshells sometimes. It's very difficult to really intuit which way he's gonna go.
What's your website, or where can people get a hold of you for your work?
So I'm on X at DJ Brummer 1938. That's really the main place to find me.
Okay, David, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.